In today's presentations, we're going to talk about if environmental regulation costs as much as we think they do. For today's presentation, we're going to be talking about the introduction, the issue, the knowledge base, the case study, Canada industry, discussion, and implications on policy makers. In this article, we will be talking about what is the best decision for Canada's economy and environment. Environmental regulations remain deeply contested and cause concern for some of the costs that will simply be too high. At the same time, surveys have shown that Canada is as concerned with environmental regulations as it is with the economy. Estimating the cost of regulation is not a perfect science, but when we analyze the data and look at the real-world cases, we can see more clearly that the cost of environmental regulations is higher than we think. Indeed, the cost of environmental regulations are often overestimated by at least double and sometimes by a factor of 10 or more. There has been a persistent argument against environmental regulation on the basis that the compliance costs to regulate firms and industries are too high. However, evidence shows that the cost of complying with environmental regulations is often overestimated. The costs that environmental regulations impose on those who are regulated are an important consideration in policy design. Although the net benefits of environmental regulations are almost always positive when including social benefits such as health impacts or reduced greenhouse gas emissions, the tendency to overestimate private costs may be artificially deflating net benefits estimates. Most importantly, inaccurate cost and benefit estimates can lead to inefficient or ineffective environmental policy design. This policy brief compares the available evidence of the estimated and realized net cost of complying with environmental regulations. Those who hold this view have often argued that the compliance costs of environmental regulation have been too high and have been a detriment to Canada's economic performance. In this view, the main argument is that those parties who fall under the regulation have a negative impact because environmental regulations require parties to either invest in more inputs for the same level of output or reduce some of their output altogether. This is because the rising private costs to meet the regulations are offset by the falling private costs due to innovation support by the regulation. In this modern view, private costs increase because of the new compliance cost. However, while the private cost of meeting the regulation generally occur before or at the time of implementation of the regulation, over time these induce innovations such as greater operational efficiency, reduced waste, new input mix, or new products that decrease or potentially even offset these compliance costs. The modern view of regulations is increasingly commonplace in economic literature. Additionally, opponents of environmental regulations have argued that some regulations influence the ability of industry to compete on an international scale or reduce productivity relative to a scenario with limited regulations, both of which could cause a loss of industry, firms, and jobs. Looking back on BC carbon tax. The British Columbia's carbon tax is a proven climate change success story, offering instructive lessons for implementing and designing carbon pricing schemes. These have largely confirmed the carbon prices project benefits while highlighting some policy design considerations. Based on these impacts, Murray and Rivers estimate that the carbon tax has reduced greenhouse gases emissions by 5 to 15% relative to business as usual scenarios, potentially even greater than the province's original projections. One recent study estimated that the tax led to a modest increase in overall employment, with jobs shifting from more emissions-intensive and trade-exposed sectors to cleaner sectors such as service.
The net benefits of environmental regulations can be estimated by a regulatory impact analysis statement. It is a form of analysis that outlines the context of a new federal regulation, including estimated costs and benefits of its implementation. Studies conducted both inside and outside government suggest that these costs tend to be overestimated, both by the regulated industries, overstating costs and underestimating the ability to innovate, and the regulators that often rely on the cost of existing technology and have a difficult access to data on the operating expenses of private companies. A draft report from the White House found that the benefits have greatly exceeded the cost for the 39 major rules introduced by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, between 2006 and 2016. For example, the estimated 2015 annual costs of this regulation were between $54 to $65 billion, while annual benefits were estimated to be between $195 to $700 billion.
The first study case is about vehicle greenhouse gas emission standards. In Canada, the regulation established standards progressively more strict over the years until 2025 on vehicles for sale. The regulation requires importers and manufacturers of new vehicles to meet fleet average emission standards for greenhouse gas emission and also includes an emission credit system. The credits can be sold or traded to other companies or can be banked for future use. The regulatory impact analysis statement reported expected total benefits of over $13 billion between 2011 and 2016, including fuel savings, reductions in air contaminants, and reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Meanwhile, the total costs were estimated to be around $4 billion. This included technology costs, compliance, promotion, enforcement, and administration, as well as costs from added noise, increased road congestion, and associated accidents as driving increases through fuel savings. Therefore, the present value of net benefits was estimated to be $9.2 billion.
In the US, they have the same type of regulation with estimated net benefits of $131 billion between 2012 and 2016. Most associated costs involved technological improvements such as weight reduction and engine efficiency. Reports from both independent organizations and the US government say the technology ended up often being cheaper than expected, and that automakers adopted new technologies quicker than expected in the EPA's initial estimations. Other evidence suggests that the tougher standards are created jobs in the US to develop and build those technologies that reduce pollution and improve fuel economy of vehicles. Let's talk about case study 2. So the sulfur in gasoline regulations protect the environment and the health of Canadians by setting limits on the amount of sulfur in gasoline produced, imported, or sold. Many groups, including the Ontario Medical Association, were in favor of a strong standard due to the health benefits, but initially some stakeholders like the gasoline industry were concerned that the cost and potential negative impact on competitiveness would be too onerous for Canada. So the regulatory impact analysis statement initially overestimated the cost. After revision, the present value of total cost is now estimated to be about $1 billion, when the net benefits for Canadians would be around $4.7 billion, including health and environmental benefits. In the US, similar regulations exist. The American Petroleum Institute was strongly opposed to this regulation when they were first proposed, claiming an increased cost of gasoline production by 10 times what the EPA calculated. But a closer review of the industry's study reveals that the costs have been overinflated. For the third case study, we have a regulation targeting the emission of nitrogen oxide and sulfur dioxide from the power sector and setting a cap and trade system. Initial cost estimates for the reduction were between $2.4 and $5 billion per year, depending on the organization that ordered the estimation. However, results from the first half of the compliance period showed annual costs under $1 billion per year. The reason for the lower compliance costs were identified as an overestimation of per-unit abatement costs and an understatement of how much technological change would be possible. The electricity industry initially argued against the regulation, with the highest cost estimates of $5 billion per year. Again, those claims proved to be an overestimation, and the introduction of the cap-and-trade system encouraged innovation and improved environmental outcomes.
Like the cases described above, initial estimates of the cost of these regulations were overestimated. A study conducted for the European initial analysis of the effort to phase out chlorofluorocarbons, that is, the primary contributors to ozone layer depletion, estimated limited potential for substitution and high costs. While the industry initially resisted the regulations, the resistance eventually subsided due to the technological innovation that allowed for the development of substitutes and alternative process to be achieved at a lower cost than anticipated. Some reports claim that the reduced use of ozone-depleting substance has a very little negative impact on the industry and that the regulation even had a positive effect on business. While the costs of the regulation were initially seen as a threat to the industry, the protocol has proven to be an inspiring success story. In 2014, United Nations reports finds that the ozone layer is recovering due to the actions under the protocol, and by mid-century, the ozone layer is expected to return to its 1980 levels. While the Montreal Protocol has been successful at phasing out ozone-depleting substance putting the ozone layer on the path to recover, it led to a shift in demand towards hydrofluorocarbons. The Kigal Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, adopted in 2016, aspired to cut the production and consumption of hydrofluorocarbons. They were suggesting that the Act's requirement would obstruct economic expansion because they would force business to incur additional expenses to comply. However, EPA evaluations show that the Act's advantage for the economy and public health have greatly surpassed its cost to business. These restrictions have especially increased each impacted child's lifetime income by well over 4,000 due to reduced pollution, fewer sick days, more schooling, and increased income as a result of cleaner air. There is an absence of literature and analysis of both compliance costs and realized benefits in Canada, especially in terms of ex-post analysis. In some cases, it is possible to find some information on compliance costs through consultant reports or academic research, but these are not common, and they rarely compare ex-ante and ex-post compliance costs for sectors of the Canadian economy. Additional data and analysis in this area would greatly enhance future policy designs. Another study by Research for the Future reviewed the literature comparing the EPA's pre-regulatory estimates of the total cost of individual regulations to the actual cost after the regulations were implemented. They found that the EPA and other regulatory agencies generally tend to overestimate the total cost of regulations. Earlier work from Resources for the Future also suggests that the unit cost of environmental regulation tend to be overestimated. The widely imaged trade-off between economic prosperity and environmental protections rests on multiple mistaken premises.
Now for the discussion part, it is clear that while estimation is an imperfect process, the tendency to overestimate is more prevalent than to underestimate. Multiple reasons have been identified. Analyses by regulators and industry are typically conservative, often failing to consider the cost-cutting innovative measures that companies can take to comply with regulations. Cost data is difficult for a regulator to retrieve. They are often forced to rely on data voluntarily supplied by industry. The regulated industry has an incentive to discourage strict regulation by inflating their cost estimates. Cost analysis for a proposed regulation are compared to a baseline without the regulation. These baselines are very hard to predict because there is no clear control group. Due to the time required to draft, amend, and implement regulations, the initial cost estimates may no longer be relevant at the time of implementation. And lastly, estimated costs of new technology often do not take into account economies of scale. Finally, let's talk about the implications for policymakers. Policymakers should account for innovation. They should build flexibility into policy design. Flexible regulations like cap and trade are more likely to lower compliance costs. They should identify appropriate baselines and control groups. They should collect more consistent data on compliance costs and benefits. Lastly, they should conduct retrospective analysis in regulatory agencies. The most important takeaway from this report is that policymakers can anticipate the initial cost estimates of environmental regulation will be high, given the uncertainties involved in scenario analysis and the tendency of industries to overestimate costs.